Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Bernasconi, and I'm the Executive Director of IISD Europe. I would like to welcome you all to this session on the interrelationship between carbon pricing, the WTO, and the Climate Convention. At the 26th Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow just a few weeks ago, countries announced new and ambitious commitments and timelines to transition to a net zero economy. But some of the commitments are more ambitious than others, and their implementation paths will vary, ranging from carbon pricing to other types of climate policies. Many of these policies will have varying impacts on international trade in goods and services. To avoid leakage and shifting greenhouse gas emissions to countries with weaker climate policies, several countries are considering putting in place border carbon adjustment measures. At IISD, we feel we cannot ignore this reality, and we would like to foster an evidence-based, nuanced discussion on impacts of border carbon adjustment measures, especially in developing and least developed countries. We would like to contribute to a discussion to bridge the divide on this issue and explore cooperative options on how to move forward while keeping in mind the delicate balance of responsibilities between developed and developing states in the context of the Climate Convention. This will be the starting point for our discussion today. We are very happy to be co-hosting this event with WTI Advisors and Climate Capital. And without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Hannes Schlömann of WTI Advisors for some welcoming remarks. Hannes, over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you everybody for being here. I think it's not much of an exaggeration to say we're today discussing one of perhaps the most important things that need to be discussed when we look at the design of the multilateral trading system and, in fact, the climate change mitigation and adaptation system of the 21st century. We are right between the two, or in fact, with one foot in one and another foot in the other. My name, as Natalie said, is Hannes Schlömann. I'm here in two capacities. I'm wearing no hat, but in fact, I'm wearing two. One is that I'm the director of WTI Advisors, one of the two directors of WTI Advisors, I should say, a trade policy law and economics advisory firm. We've been around for almost 2 decades by now. The other hat is that I'm the chief counsel of a company called Climate Capital, which is the other co-host, and we'll hear from the CEO and I believe the CTO of that company a little bit later today. In the second capacity, we're advising players, and that means in particular businesses, in their dealings, in their efforts to actually cope and live with the reality, both the ambition and the regulatory environment that we are currently talking about, and in fact, perhaps co-designing today, because we are obviously in a work in progress here. With those quick remarks, let me hand over to Alice, who is going to be the moderator of today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannes, and thank you to you and Natalie for those useful opening remarks, which I think helped us sort of situate this discussion. And I'm delighted to see how many people have joined it. We are at almost 100, so thank you for demonstrating with your interest just how important this question is. I'm delighted to moderate the next part of this session, in which we're lucky enough to have a variety of quite interesting perspectives on the question of carbon pricing, border carbon adjustments, and the trade system. And I think what we're going to aim to do is to think about the link between the UNFCCC and trade policy, and then to explore different perspectives on trade-related measures linked to carbon pricing, border carbon adjustments in particular. And we're going to start with the UNFCCC because I think, and Natalie alluded to this, at least from ISD's perspective, and I think also from Climate Capital and WTI Advisors, it's important that we recognize that trade policy is an important part of this picture, but is not necessarily driving progress. What's driving progress is an effort to ensure that we mitigate climate change to some degree. So the question is how we do that and what role trade policy plays. So we thought it would make sense to start with what's going on in the UNFCCC, and in particular in the context of what's called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that deals with a number of market-related measures, including voluntary carbon trading markets. So our first intervention is actually a video intervention from Natalie Jones, who is a staff writer at IISD's Earth Negotiations Bulletin. And for the few of you in the room who haven't yet heard of the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, it is your best source of detailed, objective, factual advice on international environmental negotiations. And it's one of the services IISD has been providing to the international community for many, many years, and one that in fact IISD is extremely well known for. So we decided there was no one better than our own colleague to help us explain what went on, what the negotiations around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement were like at Glasgow, and to give us a short summary of what was and wasn't decided in Glasgow. So I might ask our brilliant production team to pull up Natalie's video now, please.
Hello everyone, thanks for having me, and sorry I can't be live on the call with you all today. My name is Natalie Jones. I'm a research associate at the University of Cambridge, and I was at COP26 in my capacity as a writer for IISD's Earth Negotiations Bulletin. Although everything I say here will be in my individual academic capacity and not the views of ENB. I have been asked to reflect on the question, what developments were there at COP on Article 6, and how is the overall discussion of cooperative implementation going? Now, the short answer to both of those is that there was a lot of progress on Article 6 and discussions on cooperative implementation at COP26, although we will still have more discussion in the future. So after several years of negotiation, we finally saw countries agree on the rules that will govern these two international market mechanisms. This was one of the last sections of the Paris Agreement rulebook to be resolved. And in Glasgow, it was mostly a really productive and constructive atmosphere. On the whole, I think these rules provide for a carbon market that will be robust and transparent, and proponents of international carbon markets are quite optimistic that this will help countries significantly step up their mitigation efforts. So let me say a bit more about the background before we take a closer look at the main issues on the table in Glasgow. Now, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement establishes three separate mechanisms for voluntary cooperation. Article 6.2 allows countries to voluntarily make bilateral agreements to trade carbon units or to link their emissions trading schemes, whereas Article 6.4 establishes a new international carbon market governed by a UN body for the trading of emissions reductions in specific projects anywhere in the world by the private or the public sector. Article 6.8, meanwhile, establishes a work program for non-market approaches. Now, taking a very broad overview of the outcomes before we zoom into specific issues. On Article 6.2, the rules that were agreed include matters like accounting rules for these bilateral trades, what countries have to report and when, and how the trading is reviewed, recorded, and tracked. Meanwhile, on Article 6.4, the international carbon market, the rules create this Article 6.4 emissions reduction unit, which is the unit of trade corresponding to 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. Countries also establish the supervisory body that will supervise the operation of this market, outlined as governance and functions, as well as the host parties' participation responsibilities, requirements for the activity cycle, and created a registry for the mechanism. And finally, under 6.8, parties adopted a work program and established the Glasgow Committee on Non-Market Approaches. Now, to zoom into specific issues, the first one is double counting. There has always been a strong concern about double counting, meaning the situation where both countries involved in a trade count the credits towards their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, which would weaken ambition. The rules that were agreed in Glasgow seem to clearly close off most opportunities for double counting under both 6.2 and 6.4. The basic idea is that countries need to carry out corresponding adjustments on their accounting ledgers. So in simple terms, when one country sells its emissions reduction to another, it must increase its level of emission reduction in its NDC, and the purchasing country must correspondingly adjust its own emissions reduction downwards. Now, Article 6.4 does not itself, unlike Article 6.2, mention double counting. So there was a dispute as to whether corresponding adjustments need to be applied also under Article 6.4. And the outcome is quite clear that yes, corresponding adjustments apply under Article 6.4 as well as 6.2. They have to be applied at the point of authorization by a host country for all authorized carbon credits, regardless of whether they are used towards meeting countries' NDCs or for what's called other international mitigation purposes in the text, which might mean things like the CORSIA scheme, the aviation offset scheme, or even voluntary carbon markets. Now, countries agreed that these corresponding adjustments have to be applied regardless of whether a traded outcome comes from reductions inside or outside the scope of an NDC, and also regardless of whether or not the traded outcome is measured in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent or not, both of which were quite heated issues. And there were also several technical challenges countries had to overcome here. One was under 6.2, how to deal with trades between countries with NDCs that have a target of emissions in a single year versus those that set a carbon budget covering multiple years. The second aspect I want to focus in on is called OMGE, which stands for Overall Mitigation in Global Emissions, or if you want to be funny, oh my God, emissions. Article 6.4 stipulates that the mechanism has to deliver this OMGE, but parties disagreed really strongly about what this means in practice, and in particular, whether it should be delivered by automatically cancelling some credits, as well as whether OMGE applies only to 6.4 or also to 6.2. And the outcome, cancellation is mandatory only for 6.4, while it is strongly encouraged under 6.2. And the rate of mandatory cancellation under 6.4 is 2%, which is towards the lower end of what was proposed. Another issue, a really sticky one, was whether countries would allow credits that were generated under the clean development mechanism into the Article 6.4 market. Now, the Article 6.4 mechanism effectively replaces the CDM, which basically generated a lot of credits that were effectively worthless because the emission reductions would have happened anyway. Some countries wanted these projects and units to be fully carried over into the 6.4 mechanism, while others were worried that this could undermine ambition of the Paris Agreement by allowing NDCs to be met without any additional effort. And in the end, parties agreed to compromise to allow carryover of units that were generated since 2013. And the use of these is limited to the first cycle of national commitments. Experts' views differ somewhat on how much emissions this would bring into the Paris mechanism, but this is not ideal. However, what is good is that the credits will be clearly labelled in the system so buyers can choose not to use them. The final aspect I briefly wanted to highlight is that Article 6.6 of the Paris Agreement provided for a share of proceeds from the 6.4 mechanism to be set aside to support adaptation in vulnerable countries. And vulnerable states wanted this to also be extended to 6.2 and push for higher rates, whereas wealthier parties like the US and EU opposed this and said it would discourage trading. And the outcome was that the share of proceeds for adaptation would only be mandatory under 6.4 at a rate of 5%, remaining voluntary under 6.2. That's the end of what I wanted to say. I will just say, although this all constitutes a landmark and a breakthrough, this isn't the end of Article 6 as an issue at COPs. Several issues in particular were marked for further technical work next year. Under 6.2, this includes developing further guidance on how to apply corresponding adjustments, in particular on the question of single-year NDCs. And under 6.4, this includes working out the processes for how to implement this transition from the clean development mechanism, as well as OMGE and share of proceeds. So we will see further discussion of cooperative implementation next year at COP27 and probably in the future for sure. So thank you very much and best wishes for a fruitful discussion.
Super. Well, I hope you all found that helpful. I'm going to have to review it to make sure I understood all the details, not being an expert in the area. But I guess what I take away from it is that it is important to understand just how important some of these new frameworks are, and the frameworks being adopted for international trading in carbon emission units, right? And the debate that Natalie mentioned around ensuring that we were avoiding double counting in that international trade, essentially to ensure that global carbon emission markets really helped to drive emissions, is an important signal of how these international frameworks, I think, are meant to operate. So that's an important point of context, I suppose. But of course, the other important part of the discussion is not just how carbon emissions are being traded between countries to achieve mitigation, but also, of course, how carbon is going to be priced and eventually reduced within particular jurisdictions. And that's what we're going to turn to next. Because I think the discussion of market measures is not just about international trade in carbon emissions, but about domestic systems and domestic carbon markets. And here is perhaps where we see some of the biggest changes in policy in the last few months, with some very large economies introducing increasingly ambitious carbon pricing and having to think about the policy consequences of what that means. Natalie mentioned the idea of leakage, but what does it mean if your domestic carbon price is increasing significantly, particularly with respect to trade? So perhaps this is the right point to turn to you, Hannes, and ask you to give us a bit of a sense of how some of these market-based measures are being developed in particular domestic jurisdictions. How are countries moving ahead with the idea of carbon pricing and border carbon adjustments? And what does this have to do with trade rules? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thanks also in absentia to Natalie for this wonderful, very fast-paced introduction to what came out of COP26. The dots connect first and foremost at one particular point. We're talking about the internalization of externalities. That's really what carbon pricing is about. So the real question is, can the WTO framework, can the WTO accommodate policies of members that try to internalize externality? That is the philosophical question, or perhaps the legal question, the policy question in principle. Of course, then the devil, or perhaps the angel, is in the detail, and we'll get to some of that, but we don't have the 5 hours that we would need to explore all the nitty-gritty of this. How do you mitigate emissions? Well, how do you mitigate climate change? How do you avoid emissions? But it's essentially 3 things you can do. You can ask people to simply do it because it's the right thing to do. You can regulate, and you can price the emission of carbon. If you price it, there are essentially 2 big mechanisms to do that. One is to tax, and the other one is to create a cap and trade system, an emissions trading system. And I want to see whether I can quickly show you this. Let's see whether this works. This is from the 2021 World Bank et al. Report on carbon pricing, and it shows you a little bit of who is doing carbon pricing and in what way. I'm not going to spend time on this, but I just wanted to show you that there are a lot of people and a lot of countries in the world that adopt one or the other or both mechanisms that lead to carbon prices. And that starting point is important because all of these countries are trying to do something, trying to use the third method, which is to put a price on carbon so that when you do emit, that is your opportunity cost, and you can not emit and then have that money or save that money. So the question is, if that leads to an internalization of externalities, carbon emissions being a price on society, on worldwide society, that we all have to pay unless the emitter pays it, then the question is, can we link that to products so that the products carry the carbon footprint with them as they get traded? And that in turn raises the question, can the WTO framework do this? The WTO framework is based on many things, but in particular, one simple principle. Costs should be all condensed into, transmission costs across borders should all be condensed into one single metric, which is the tariff. Now, that principle is not done in a consequent way. It's not implemented all over the place. It's a lot more complex, but the idea is to have a simple metric. So I think the real question for carbon pricing and the WTO and the future of both together is, can carbon pricing be done in a way and adjusted in a way that amounts to a simple metric, a metric that is in the end acceptable to everybody who's dealing with the subject matter, or at least operates within a band and I believe Aaron will somehow come back to this point in his own words, that is acceptable and that allows people to get on with this important task. Because the regulatory approach alone might simply not do it, and we need carbon pricing. And at the moment we do carbon pricing, the question of adjustment at the border arises. Now, Lord Stern, among many other people, said free emissions are like a subsidy. So in a way, CBAM is a countervailing measure to free emissions done by people who are not subject to carbon pricing. I'm simplifying grossly, but that's roughly what it is. Dr. Ngozi has recently in the FT piece in October warned that fragmentation is a big risk for the world trading system, fragmentation in carbon pricing, fragmentation that results from unequal methods, unequal approaches to carbon pricing, and has called for a global carbon price. She also warned about greenflation. That's a related problem, but different, so I'll leave that aside. But she said we might look at trade friction if we don't get this right. I think it's an important warning, but I think the question is, does trade really require lockstep? Because she also recommends that we need to get to a global carbon price. Does trade require lockstep? Does trade policy require a lockstep? Does WTO law require that all countries go exactly in lockstep as they carbon price or impose prices on carbon and then adjust them at the border like VAT? I'm not sure we need to do full lockstep, but some harmonization and communication and cooperation is definitely desirable, as much as we can possibly muster. Trade friction, yes, the risk exists in the sense that trade and traders and trade policy will be asked to adjust. Producers, exporters, and in particular importers, and I know that Doug will come back to this point, Doug and Michael will come back to this point in the context of the European CBAM. Importers, people who have nothing to do or have never dealt with carbon emissions, all of a sudden have the spotlight on them. Trade friction, no, in the sense that border carbon adjustment, if properly executed, is actually, as I just tried to say, a mechanism to reduce trade friction that would otherwise emerge. The buzzword here is carbon leakage. So what do we do with this? Well, can we get a global carbon price? I'm not sure. That's a long-term project, definitely desirable. It would be great, but unlikely to happen. What we could perhaps get to, I should say that, is something like a minimum carbon price, like the OECD's minimum income tax for corporate income tax. That approach might be possible. But what is a solution for the future might be a common methodological approach or something close to it. And for that, really, the WTO is not a bad place. We have experiences on TBT, SPS, but also subsidies, taxes. We have years of jurisprudence and committee work that tried to sort of approximate concepts and approaches. And I think we can build on that. So I would be optimistic here. Developing countries, definitely an important part of things, important element to look out for. We cannot ignore common but differentiated responsibility. In fact, we have to accommodate it in the trading system. And if that means being creative when interpreting Article 20 and other provisions of WTO law, so be it. Let's be creative. So let me out myself as a fan of both Dr. Ngozi and Greta Thunberg. We have no time to waste. That's how she concluded her piece. And let's act as if the house is on fire, because it is. And that means we need to come up with the creativity to adjust this in the world trading system. The question is perhaps not so much, can the WTO accommodate carbon pricing? And that means to some extent, some sort of adjustment. But the question is, can the WTO do without that? And I personally don't think it can. But let me conclude with Angela Merkel, who's about to go out of office. She said, we can do this. Wir schaffen das. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Hannes. Very, very interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. And I'll come back to you at the very end for some concluding thoughts too. But I suppose what a neophyte like I take away from this is In particular, the need for simplicity and transparency in the measures adopted. And we might hear from Michael and Douglas about the business perspective and from Arafi as well. And coming to the international cooperation point, which is one that's very dear to my heart, the idea that we needed a very minimum dialogue, perhaps cooperation about how measures are adopted, the common methodological approach you talked about, even if lockstep harmonization of measures is a long-term objective, if it is one at all. So those are, I think, sort of useful policy messages to keep in our minds as we go through. But at the center of all of this policy debate in Geneva is, of course, the businesses who are actually going to be affected by these government decisions, many who are going to be required to know exactly how much carbon they emit and required to either buy carbon credits or sell them, and might need help doing all of that and understanding exactly what their obligations are. So I'm delighted to invite Douglas and Michael to give us, I guess, the business perspective on this new world of carbon pricing. What does it look like from your perspective?
Okay, thank you very much. Can we look at the PowerPoint, please? Can we open that? Right, so second slide, please. Okay, so how the CBAM certificate chargeable amount is calculated, as Hannes was saying already, it's basically a market-based price. So it's based on the average of the last week, trading week, EUA, EU allowance, ETS price. Okay, so to calculate the CBAM charge, we need to multiply the quantity of the product sold in tons by the carbon intensity, which is measured in tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas per ton of product, by the average of the last working week EUA ETS price. Okay, that would be the standard default scenario. In a situation where an exporting country exporting into the EU, a company exporting into the EU from that country prices carbon either in the form of a carbon tax or in the form of a carbon trading scheme, such as in China, Japan, New Zealand. You deduct from that CBAM charge the price of carbon from the exporting country. Okay, so that's basically how we calculate the CBAM certificate. Each importer who's importing from a country of a list of covered products, aluminium, steel, iron, ammonia, fertilizer, and so on, has to do so. So Mike will talk about that in a moment. Could we have the next slide, please? Next slide. Yeah, so this is the EUA price since 2019. It's increased dramatically despite COVID. The reason it has increased dramatically is because of policy change within the market. Previously, all covered entities, of which there were about 12,000 in Europe before Brexit, so their particular plants, electricity generators, oil refineries, steelworks, etc., they got their carbon credits free. Okay, that was removed in 2019. Where Western companies, electricity generators, now need to buy them at auctions. And that has caused, that policy change really has caused the huge increase in the price of carbon. Okay, next slide, please. So these are the countries by the four, we'll not consider electricity, the four industrial categories, product categories that will be most impacted by CBAM. Aluminium, cement, fertilizer, iron, steel. And you can see the country most affected is Russia, followed by Turkey, followed by the UK. Now, neither Russia nor Turkey have carbon pricing systems. The UK does. On Brexit, it created the UK ETS, so there will be a reduction there. China has an ETS. It's been in place for about 4 years. Okay. So that's the likely impact of CBAM by different country. Mike, can I hand over to you now?
Sure. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there's a lot of complexity going on there, and we won't have time to get into all the detail of that. But down at the individual product level, there's going to be an administrative process by which companies who are importing can arrange for verification and certification of the carbon intensity of the product that they are importing into the EU. In the absence of that, a somewhat punitive default rate will be used. This is all going to be quite complex to administer, but fundamentally, the patchwork of impacts is across sectors and across countries, and it will vary tremendously. It will also vary according to the very specific products. This is a very gross analysis that we did as a first sketch. Once you dive into an individual product for an individual plant crossing a border, that is where the numbers will be calculated. So we did some analysis at a very high level, and it's a pretty broad set of impacts and relatively significant numbers. Can we have the next slide, please? So one of the things that you can't control in that scenario, you can control conceivably your carbon intensity of where you source products from, or what you do in your factory to make it cleaner. One of the things you cannot control is the market for the ETS market, that is the index price for calculating the CBAM certificate charge. So we do predictive modeling out at various timescales from days to weeks to months to years of what is likely to happen in that market. So if you have some advanced knowledge of that, you might try to, for example, optimize your timing of an EUA ton if you are a covered entity, or you might think about optimizing the timing of your imports where that feasible. But this is going to impose a whole load of new thinking and new complexity on people who haven't had to deal with this before. Next slide, please. So we could start to imagine, and as somebody who already said, this is very much a work in progress. We could start to imagine, and we could start to hope what the impact of all of this would be. We know, I think we can be confident there's going to be quite a lot of admin involved in this, a lot of chasing around, weighing things, measuring things, certifying things, auditing things. You've got that basic formula that Doug covered at the beginning, which is the quantity times the price gives you the charge, right? You can control potentially your carbon intensity. So this is, if you're an importer and you source a lower intensity version of the product you're importing, your CBAM charge will be lower. So one could imagine opportunities for people who have cleaner production processes. And when I say cleaner, I'm talking about carbon intensity. You might imagine quite a lot of impacts on some of those exporting countries, and they might start losing business. They might come under pressure to improve and invest in their own production processes. And let's remember that EUA price has gone up dramatically over the past year or two, and there are a number of credible forecasts of it going considerably higher over the next decade. You might, as an exporting country government, you might just sort of kind of not do anything. You might take this to a WTO tribunal court process. You might actually introduce your own local carbon pricing scheme if you don't have one, because your companies are going to be paying 60 euros a ton to the EU fund. Would you rather tax that at 20 locally, and then that keeps the money in your country, in your treasury, and then the EU collects 40 out of that 60? So you might see more carbon pricing schemes. We would hope that the internalization of this externality that is carbon pollution drives positive change, drives companies to seek out the cleanest possible suppliers, drives them to invest in innovation, research, new ways of producing carbon-free steel or aluminium. There's already some exciting new developments there, and this would give an economic assistance to those new efforts. People might start thinking about when they import, because it's the week when you import that matters. That could get really complex. There's probably a whole load of possible impacts that we haven't thought of there, but it's the ambition and the hope is that all of this market forces and the paper chase that will ensue and the pricing pressure will fundamentally drive capital and investment and business decisions to a lower carbon economy in Europe, but also outside. So I think I'll stop there and hand back over.
No, super. Thank you very much, Michael and Doug. And I think that's been a useful kind of deep dive into how businesses see this, right? And just to kind of recap the various things we've seen, because I think there's actually quite a useful kind of graphic picture emerging. Remember Hannes's slide with the map of the various countries that are imposing carbon pricing, right? So we know that this is something that's coming along. I remember very specifically the graph that Doug showed us of how carbon pricing, at least in the EU, is increasing significantly, right? So it's increased already, it might be expected to increase further. And of course, the greater the carbon price a domestic EU manufacturer faces, the greater the risk, is the perception, the greater the risk of leakage of emissions to other jurisdictions producing the same products that aren't subject to that same carbon price, right? So that fear of leakage, as Natalie was saying at the beginning, is one of the reasons that has led to the idea of imposing a border carbon adjustment measure, right? So amounts essentially that are charged on imports of particular products that are both emissions intensive and trade exposed. And the graph that I think it was at that point Michael showed of the various products and the different levels of trade exposure was quite useful, right? You could see how aluminium differed from iron and steel, for instance. So that's fundamentally what we're talking about. And I think what was really helpful from that presentation is it helped us to think through how businesses approach this question. And it's essentially around optimizing their business processes in a world where border carbon adjustments apply, right? So maybe it's about who you buy from, maybe you choose lower carbon producers, how you manufacture yourself, can you improve your own carbon efficiency? And at the end of the day, I think that the last line you said, Michael, was extremely helpful. At the end of the day, the idea, the hope is that this new market mechanism, the price and the pressure that the pricing applies will drive capital investment to lower carbon production in Europe, but also outside. And that's probably the perfect segue to our next presentation, because the business perspective on what border carbon adjustments mean is probably very different whether you're a financial services firm in Europe or whether you're an exporter of green products in a developing country. So I'm delighted now to bring in Aarti Krishnan, who's a research fellow at the Global Development Institute at Manchester University, and she's done some very interesting work looking at the implications of border carbon adjustments on green exports from developing countries. So to see the other business perspective, so to speak, Aarti, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just quickly share my slide. So primarily here, what I wanted to talk about, I think what Michael and Doug were saying and what Alice just said was exactly my starting point, is if we do need to think about a way of internalizing these sort of externalities, then what should we do from a developing country perspective? Because a lot of the discussion around border carbon adjustments is obviously how we need to increase exports to developed countries in general. So if you take a step back and think about, well, what's the point of BCAs and what's the point of environmental instruments in general? Are there egalitarian motivations? Is the plan that countries then, especially developing countries, need to level up, which is exactly what was being said. And how do you promote these just transitions in that case? And so there's a spectrum of leveling up. So the sort of analysis that we were doing was thinking about, either you think about it in a value chain context and say, should I green specific tasks as a developing country for specific sectors? Or do I then overhaul the process? If I can't and I reach some sort of green frontier where I can't green more tasks, do I need to then overhaul and change the structure completely by being born clean in terms of new carbon standards? When introducing, like, for example, new sustainability standards, new policies, and new regulations. So the big point of this was to think about, okay, now if you do need to level up, first, what are the sort of products we need to think about to level up? And this is where it becomes important to look at, oh, then how do I contribute more towards my NDCs? So what we tried to do was look at a set of exports. So we took an example to make this a bit more concrete from East African countries, so countries within the East African community, and try to look at a composite index of the revealed comparative advantage they have for green products that they export and the stability they have of exporting these products. And we looked at this vis-a-vis the EU. Look at, so to what extent do East African countries export to the EU, and how many of them are green sort of products, and how stable are they? And we divided them into, we created an index, and I'm not going to go into details of the index, but I'm happy to discuss it later as well, or share a paper on this. But the sort of two main things that came about was, based on the spectrum of this index, we looked at cash cows, which is where the specific products where these countries actually have strengths to deliver maximum green potential, and sunrise products, where countries are just growing in their green exports and can actually start becoming greener in these specific products. So briefly, these are the sort of green strengths and green weaknesses that we saw. So the first table, which you see here, is looking at the EAC, different EAC countries and their revealed comparative advantage. So vis-a-vis selling to the first one is sort of the world. So in general, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, about between 22% to 1% of their products have some sort of revealed green comparative advantage. And I'll talk about these products in the next slide. Out of which the cash cows are in the second sort of segment here, where you're like, well, Kenya has about 6% of its total products are cash cow products, where they can actually maximize green potential. And they can mitigate and adapt so much that they can actually reach a sort of stage where they're now able to be a completely green value chain. And then there are certain products that are about 2% of the products, which are sort of sunrise products, where there is potential to start going green. So the two sort of graphs you have on your on the other side of the PowerPoint presentation are sort of looking at the number and the percentage in a stacked way across these countries. So Kenya in general has the most number of cash cows, which have green potential, followed by Tanzania, Uganda, and then Rwanda and Burundi. So I'm happy to discuss this a bit further, but I think the next slide gives a bit more detail onto which these sort of categories are. Now, funnily enough, if you're thinking about it in terms of promoting functional upgrading of specific NDCs, the sort of main categories that were drawn out where it is possible to maximize the amount of green exports are some of the following. And funnily enough, none of these fall under the BCA sort of three categories. But there are a complete different set of categories for which you need a completely different set of environmental governance structures, because every one of these categories also has other kind of non-trade barriers. For example, standards, which is another kind of trade barrier, and they need to develop these sort of standards. So what we kind of looked at was across, so these categories that we've come across over here are sort of the overlapping categories that so this was done at a 6-digit level. So we presented some details at 2-digit level because it was too complicated to show the 6-digit level product discussions. But across all these countries, these are the sort of the HS03, HS71 are the sort of key categories. So like live trees and plants, for example, form 6% of all cash cows across these different countries on an average. And so then what we did was, the aim then is to think about, okay, now we've found a way to understand where you can maximize green potential, but then how? So then you kind of look at the entire value chain for some of these sections, and then you break it down into different number of tasks. So what you see as the column over here, the fourth column on this table, are the number of tasks. And this is the average number of tasks that take place from upstream in the value chain when the product is beginning to the point of export. And then you map, based on these tasks, how many tasks can you then green? And then the table right next to that sort of shows the number of tasks that are green. And these are sort of average values. So in general, you can see that almost 50% of the tasks that take place in all these sort of categories can actually be green. There is potential for greening, but it's not really done in this process. And for example, this could be linked to using more geothermal. For example, Kenya uses a lot of geothermal and solar power. It could be linked to using more geothermal and solar power in plants. And so it's almost like every single one of these points is sort of disaggregated to understand, oh, at what point can I use some sort of greening technology, whether it is a function that can be green or a sort of product or a process that can be green, in order to overarchingly make this a sort of greener transition. So that led us to some big questions. Is once you sort of understand what can be greened, do countries have the capabilities of greening these functions? Do you then start with low-hanging fruits, but then you don't necessarily meet the, oh my God, emission sort of target as was put earlier? So then you need to go one step above. And then if you have a space then where you found a whole set of products based on greening potential that are not necessarily on the WTO universal list of environmental good acts products, which are now not necessarily under the purview of BCAs, where do you go and where do you have your voice heard in this process? So a good starting point is obviously the sort of structured discussions within the WTO. And then you think about, once you've understood how these greening processes work, are there sort of spillover effects in order to then further internalize some of these externalizations? Because there's a lot of work that's done on BCAs that talk about carbon leakage, but there's much less on possible spillover through these different effects. So if you have things happening within countries and you have countries themselves trying to green certain value chains where they themselves can be more competitive, because cash cows are already segments where they are competitive. So then greening it just makes it more competitive. So that goes towards contributing to then NDCs specifically. And that's another alternative way of thinking about how different environmental instruments can actually promote greening and NDCs in different value chains. Yeah, thank you.
That was fascinating, Arati. Thank you very much indeed. And I think, again, kind of we'll be keen to have the slides afterwards too, just to really focus in on where some of these opportunities lie for developing countries. But I'm going to bring in now a different perspective, I suppose, on the development angle of border carbon adjustments. One not so much about the tariff lines, but about the politics, and in particular, the question of where trade policy discussion around BCAs could take place. So I'm delighted to welcome Lu Shankun, a former Chinese diplomat and old friend of mine, and now the managing director of LEDECO Geneva, to give us his perspective. Lu, your perspective from a development angle, what are the implications of some of these BCAs in the context of multilateral discussions?
Yeah, thank you, Alice, for this. And of course, thanks to both ISD and WTI advisors for the invitation. I mean, my job is very simple. It's about how we relate this to the WTO, but it's also probably something very much complicated. I mean, to start with that, the issue of border carbon adjustment, the BCA, is within, as we're discussing now, the broader context of climate change and trade. So we heard good news is that COP26 it was a success, and now we just need to see how WTO and trade plays in. The starting point is that, as the big slogans always go, that climate change is a global challenge that calls for collective actions and then multilateral cooperation. And then which of course need to accommodate all countries, big or small, developed and developing, for to achieve sustainable growth and development. On that, I mean, just to repeat what I said always, is that trade, of course, is an indispensable element in the climate change toolbox and has an important role to play. Therefore, the carbon border adjustment is one element of the whole equation of climate change and trade. On this, of course, as I said in the past, that the EU does have legitimate concerns on carbon leakage and level playing field, so on and so forth. The question is, how do we deal with such concerns? Unilateral through national actions like CBAM, or collectively through WTO negotiations? My humble view is always that we have to do this through the WTO instead of border adjustment, carbon adjustment, such as CBAM, which of course, as we are hearing now, arouses controversy about is consistent with WTO rules, its progress, be it for protectionism or for climate change, or its lacuna on development aspect. So in the WTO discussion, many issues, I mean, this is my view, that including, I mean, green goods and services, related subsidies and potential accountability measures, related measures that could constitute technical barriers, agricultural licensing, carbon linkage and carbon price, and also very importantly, development aspect around this common but differentiated responsibility on the climate change and especially differential treatment on the WTO, all needs to come in. A lot of work needs to be done, in particular on the last point, to really build up the capacity building of developing countries so that they integrate climate change and sustainability into their development strategy from the very beginning, so as to avoid what has happened in the past is that first developed countries pollute, and then China and other emerging economies, and then in the future, most probably other developing countries which will catch up, so on and so forth. So, and such new WTO solutions, including the development aspect, must respond directly to the strategic development needs of developed countries, I mean, so that we could engage them. How to address them, I mean, your question there, I will refrain from lecturing my former WTO colleagues and who have much better ideas about what is at stake and what needs to be done. The question is that they have many ideas and they don't necessarily come together with each other. So it's how to bring the ideas together and converge them into a single WTO solution. Right now in the WTO, to be frank, my humble observation is that the discussion there is very much falling behind what is discussed in real world, like now. And many things we're discussing about simple metrics, about carbon pricing and so on and so forth, and development. So it's not there yet. And the WTO right now basically are struggling to establish a kind of innovative structure, this so-called joint statement initiatives to discuss trade and sustainability. From my information that we do now have this trade and environmental sustainability structure discussion, so TSSD, which is more general, and then it's plastic initiative and fossil subsidies, which are more specific. And interesting thing is that we're now witnessing contributions on climate change from some members, including recently from WTO website, Japan, EU, Iceland, Switzerland, and New Zealand. And then the interesting thing is that in the EU proposal itself, that's on 16th February this year, the EU did propose that other than climate-friendly goods and service, we should also look at the development aspect, how to engage developing countries, but also to look into the transparency of domestic measures, such as the carbon board mechanism. So things are going on there. I think we need to catch up that momentum and see how we could materialize in really a kind of WTO-wide structured discussion on all this. One last word, I mean, just to balance what I have said many times in the past, is that it's easy that we criticize the EU on CBAM and then other members, US, Canada, and others who may take similar actions, and then we don't do anything in the WTO. And we do witness in the WTO that with some members refusing to do much beyond what's so-called traditional issues on the Doha and before, including the refusal to do anything much on environmental and sustainability. The problem is that, as many previous speakers have said, and Hannah has said this, is that the planet cannot wait, and the willing countries won't wait. And then come people like you and me cannot wait because we are seeing many disasters. Now we have a Glasgow climate change, so then members were implemented, and the carbon leakage will come up, and the carbon price, so on and so forth. And if we cannot do it at the WTO collectively, and then it will be done in a different manner elsewhere, and quite possibly in a unilateral manner, such as CBAM by EU and others. So my humble advice is always that even that WTO is not in an ideal situation, but we need to address this in the WTO, and WTO, of course, in collaboration with UNCCC. And of course, I'm not paid by WTO to say this, but many of my friends within our group, the Friends of Multilateralism, have a similar line of thoughts on that. So with that, I stop here. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Lou. That was fascinating. And I think it's sort of tangentially, you've actually also answered one of the questions in the chat. I should say there are more questions in the chat, wonderful questions, that tragically we're not going to be able to answer all of them. Douglas is doing his best to answer many in writing, so thank you, Douglas, for doing that. I'm going to give the floor next to Aaron, but I'm conscious of time. I want to just send one of the chat questions, perhaps to you, Michael, and to you, Arati, because there's a couple of questions that sort of speak, I think, to the same thing. So to give you a few minutes to think about the response. There was a question there for you, Michael, that said, do you feel one of the scenarios would be that some producing or commodity importers in the EU might move production of finished goods overseas as to avoid border carbon adjustment measures? And there's the sort of the reverse question, and so I'd appreciate your sense of it, Arti. A lot of your data focused very much on primary products, the sort of stuff that developing countries gain a lot of revenue from now. But the flip side of the question, which is also in the chat, is that assuming some supplies of raw materials to manufacturers within CBAM geographies become more expensive, is there a chance that border carbon adjustment measures offer an opportunity for developing and emerging countries to move up the value chain and export finished products? Will the competitive landscape of manufacturers change as well? Perhaps in some senses, CBAMs are designed to minimize that, or to at least slow the transition. But I'd be interested in your perspectives on that, those two flip sides of the same question. But with that, I'm going to hand the floor now, very late, so thank you, Aaron, for being so patient, to my own colleague, Aaron Cosby, who's probably one of the world's leading experts on border carbon adjustment, to give us another sense of his thoughts on the international cooperative opportunities we have here. So Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks to all that have gone before me for laying the ground so well. I'm going to talk a little bit about the need, in my mind, for international cooperation on border carbon adjustment, what that might look like, where it might take place. First, I'll put forward the proposition that we're going to see more and more instruments like the EU CBAM adopted at the national level. The reason being that border carbon adjustment is not a self-isolated, independent instrument. It is linked intricately to domestic climate ambition. So it's no coincidence that the EU, probably the most advanced in its climate ambition, with a pledge to reduce 55% of its 1990 emissions by 2030, built into law, is also the first to establish a CBAM. It's no coincidence that Canada, with the carbon price legally scheduled to rise to $170 a ton by 2030, is also considering a CBAM. It's, so we are seeing more action on border carbon adjustment because we are seeing more climate ambition. We now have 74 parties to the UNFCCC that have communicated net zero goals, comprising 81 countries. That covers almost 75% of global GHG emissions. And you may say that's all talk, but it's talk that didn't happen even a year ago. And moreover, some 30 of those countries have put those commitments into law. So with this trend on rising climate ambition will come the need for more countries to think about how they protect against leakage in the context of that ambition. We are going to see more and more countries turning to the possibility of putting in place border carbon adjustment. The second contention is that we don't want to see, it would be unfortunate if we saw a spaghetti bowl of separate national approaches not driven by any international consensus on what border carbon adjustment should look like, for two primary reasons. One is that when you do a national policy setting exercise like that, there are plenty of opportunities for the needle to get pushed more toward the protection of domestic industry than it is toward the protection of the environment. You simply have more opportunities for national lobbying and more political pressure to protect your domestic industries. We've dealt with those kinds of pressures in the context of trade by establishing the body of law under the WTO, which tries to multilateralize agreement on what best practice is at the international level. The second reason is simple trade facilitation. If I'm an exporter of steel and I have to comply with standards, border carbon adjustment data requirements in 7 different countries, all reporting to a different standard, all requiring me to certify my GHG intensity to some different accredited certifier and put it in some different registry, this raises my costs enormously. To the extent we can facilitate trade while carbon pricing internationally, we should. So what does that cooperation look like exactly? What am I talking about here? So IISD has proposed, and I'll put a link to this in the chat, an illustrative list of principles and best practices, 5 principles, 6 items of best practice that might guide the way domestic actors put in place and elaborate and implement border carbon adjustment. In principles, for example, we have the idea of the primacy of leakage protection as the aim of a border carbon adjustment, as opposed to using it as an instrument of coercion to make other countries change their policies, or as opposed to an instrument to protect domestic sectors. We have the principle of credit for equivalence. So any border carbon adjustment should take account of a carbon price paid in the country of export. We have the principle of revenue sharing. So all the significant money that will come from a border carbon adjustment should, in our view, be shared back in some form to the affected exporters and exporting host countries. Examples of best practice would include a common standard for calculating GHG emissions intensity of products when they show up at the border, so firms are only certifying to a single standard. The idea of challengeable assumptions. So if you're using a default GHG intensity to understand what the price you're going to charge is for any given good, that default should be challengeable by an exporter who can claim that they are cleaner than the default value you have set them. Just a number of principles and best practices like this, we think of this kind could be useful if adopted at the international level in guiding how border carbon adjustment is elaborated at the national level. What would that agreement look like? I mean, how would you, where would it take place? How could it be done? We know that the EU has a schedule whereby they will have a border carbon adjustment called CBAM in place by 2023, according to their schedule. They're far ahead of the process, but other countries are on board. Well, the agreement, in our view, should not be a negotiated binding agreement. We're in a forum here that focuses on WTO, so I need to state that at the outset. We're not talking about legally binding agreement. We're not even talking about an agreement to harmonize approaches. Hannes Schlöben very usefully talked about the divergence between the need to lockstep national approaches and the need to coordinate national approaches or bring them under some sort of common understanding of best practice, as is done in the WTO. We're talking here about an agreement on principles of best practice that can be adapted to the different carbon pricing regimes in national countries. Necessarily, we're not talking about harmonizing the same border carbon adjustment regime in every country, because as I said at the beginning, border carbon adjustment accompanies the domestic carbon pricing regime, and that pricing regime looks different in every country. The European Union has an emissions trading scheme. Canada has an output-based pricing scheme. Sweden has a carbon tax. Each one of those involves a very different BCA, border carbon adjustment. So we're not talking about an agreement that would say what a border carbon adjustment has to look like, but rather principles and best practices that would guide the implementation of different border carbon adjustment regimes within each country. So what could that agreement look like? Where a good precedent, in my view, is the reference paper on regulatory principles that was concluded as part of the negotiations on the agreement on basic telecommunications, the WTO's telecoms agreement. This was an agreement, this was an agreed reference paper, a set of principles, models for domestic law in how you go about liberalizing the telecom sector. There was multilateral agreement on it, but it was not a binding document. It represented what countries could agree was best practice in terms of opening up these sectors to international competition. And it was crucially impactful in how that liberalization was done internationally. Many countries built it into their domestic commitments, in the services sector commitments. Another potential example is the Working Party on BTA, border tax adjustment in the WTO. This was done in 1970. It it was not a scheduled agreement about a binding commitment to do things in a certain way, but it was in response to the rise of value-added tax, an instrument that we didn't know how to deal with, and it tried to understand what is best practice in this area. This and the report of the Working Party laid out something like consensus, but it recorded where there wasn't consensus. It also has been hugely influential in shaping how domestic policy has gone forward. So these, I think, are interesting precedents for how an agreement on best practices and principles could be put together. I think the WTO as a multilateral setting is probably the best place in which it could happen, although I don't know where that could happen. Ideally, it happens within the WTO in a group like the Committee on Trade and Environment, which has a mandate that could accommodate it. But probably it needs to, probably it would be end up being something that can countenance plurilateral agreement, like the joint statement initiatives or the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions. In any case, I'll leave it there, having argued the need for this kind of agreement and what it might look like. I look forward to the rest of our discussions. Thank you.
No, thank you, Aaron, because I think that's really helped to pull together, in fact, some of the initial comments that that both Natalie and Hannes were making at the beginning about the options for cooperation. And I think the next job, maybe for the next webinar, is to think about some of the more detailed implications we've heard, both from Michael and Arti, about what this really means for businesses and therefore what cooperative options could look like. I know that Arti has already responded promptly to the question that I had put to her earlier about the opportunity for CBAMs to lead to greater opportunities for developing country exporters of finished products. Michael, do you want to have a stab at that before I come back to Hannes, perhaps for some concluding remarks?
Certainly, I could do. Doug may chime in as well.
Okay.
So I'll leave him to jump in as he is fit. So the question was, questions scrolled off the top of the screen. Fundamentally, is a car manufacturer in Europe going to start moving its factories out of Europe to avoid paying? It was consumer goods and so on and so forth, but let's pick the car scenario. That was one of them. Would an EU car manufacturer offshore its factory to outside of the EU to actually avoid this extra tariff? I won't try and speak for the European car industry, and this is just my best guess, and this whole thing is a work in progress, so I would defer to any number of people who will be far more expert than I on predicting this. One scenario you could imagine is that actually what a European car manufacturer will do is just source the cleanest possible steel and aluminium that it can find. The relative cost disadvantage that a European producer currently pays in the form of EU ETS charges is now going to be mitigated by the import tariff. So you might get some reverse leakage. Yeah, you might get some stuff, some dirty steel being shipped in from overseas might get displaced by some cleaner steel produced within the EU. Yeah, hypothetically, if there is such a product, because now we've equalized the charges for carbon on both of those sources, right? So that you could imagine that people fundamentally will look for the cleanest possible source, because either way, it's then going to be taxed. At the moment, it's only taxed if that steel is produced in the EU. Yeah. So there's almost an incentive to import from outside, and that may actually be a higher carbon intensity product. Now those two products will compete on their relative merits, obviously of quality and price and so on and so forth, but there'll be a more level playing field on the carbon intensity. So I would hope that irrespective of where the cleanest steel comes from, there is a good market for the cleanest steel, and that drives a signal through the supply chain to get producers to progressively clean up their processes. That would be my optimistic view. I guess another perspective is, I think if I've got if I built a car factory in Germany, and there's there is an increase in my raw product import cost, I think actually the net value add that I provide turning that steel into a car is so significant that I wouldn't relocate my entire production process just to try and dodge it. Especially because one might imagine that wherever I relocate to try and dodge it, there's a pretty good chance they're going to introduce a carbon tax in 5 years anyway. So those would be two different perspectives, but it is it's very hard making predictions, especially about the future.
Well said. Yogi Berra is one of my favorites too. And just to note, Aaron's also added his sense that so if basic goods are covered by a BCA, but not goods further down the value chain, is what we're talking about, then in theory, the risk of leakage simply moves down the value chain as well. So the ideal might be BCA coverage part of the way down the value chain to semi-finished products, but perhaps not all the way to finished products. And I guess there's a policy trade-off there. I mean, imagine the complexity of trying to design a system that estimated the amount of carbon emissions created in a car that has probably several million different pieces in it. Aaron, you've unmuted yourself. Have I misrepresented you? Feel free to correct me if I have.
Oh, that's all right. But we also
Okay.
go to Michael's point that the further down the value chain you go, the more value added there is in a product relative to the carbon embedded in the product. So the risk of leakage diminishes as you go down the value chain. Really, the point at which you stop covering a good under a BCA scheme should be determined by the risk of leakage. And as you go down the value chain, the risk of leakage diminishes.
Yeah. Okay. Super. That's been extremely helpful. I'm conscious of time, and I do want to make sure that I've left enough time for my co-organizer, Hannes, to have a few concluding remarks. So Hannes, take it away.
Alice, thank you so much. I'll just take 60 seconds, really. I think we learned COP was in many ways, COP26 was in many ways a success on the way towards a more internalized, carbon internalized world. I think that's good news in itself. I think the WTO will cope. So we heard some voices here. I think in the end, Lou and I don't disagree. The only question is how do we get the system to cope? And yes, cooperation is certainly the best forward. Aaron, your call is well heard. I hope it is well heard over there, 2 kilometers down the road. I would add to, as examples of good successes here, the soft law efforts in the SPS and TBT committees to move towards good regulatory practices. I think there is a million ways forward here. We don't have to think only, you don't, in fact, that's what you're saying, but we don't have to only think in like, let's agree on a carbon price as a treaty or nothing. No, we can do a million things in between. And I think the enormous value of that work that ICTSD put out is to highlight that we have a lot of ways how we can make these interlocking mechanisms, these communicating tubes work. And I think all we need is a good dose of good attitude and creativity. And that will also get us through the legal hurdles. To answer one of the questions, no, I am not afraid of major disputes at the WTO on this. I think the world has moved beyond this. We're no longer discussing shrimp turtle. Yes, there will be tension, and unilateralism or unilaterally moving forward is not great, but this is different from almost anything else. The target and the urgency is so great, and the target is moving so fast that we need to move along. So we need to make it up as we go. I think that is the reality, but I think we can. And as I said, wir schaffen das.
Thank you, Hannes. That's super. I hope you have all of you listening have found this as useful a discussion as I have. I think it's been a really detailed, sometimes quite technical, but usefully detailed discussion of different perspectives on the table about the real world implications of border carbon adjustments for companies within BCA jurisdictions and companies and exporters in developing countries. And that also where many of the questions in the chat have led us. I think from my perspective, it's clear we need a conversation in the trade policy sphere somewhere about the policy choices available with the nuanced evidence-based perspective that we've tried to bring you today. Particularly when politics are running high, as they may be around BCAs, the best way to cut through all of that noise, I think, is a balanced approach and some good hard evidence about what's actually happening. So sincere thanks to all of our speakers for helping to bring us that sort of evidence and a sense of balance to the discussion. We will probably be doing several more of these webinars because the issue is not going away, as we know. So thank you very much to Climate Capital, and thank you to the WTI advisors for co-organizing with us. Thank you to the production team who are brilliant, and please join us for the next session of today. And thank you very much indeed. Good evening.
Thank you.